Hello ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and welcome to another faction guide for Rome to Divide et Impera. Today we're going to be looking at Pergamon, which is actually a rather interesting Hellenic faction. Like on the surface, you may assume that they're rather generic. However, the interesting part of Pergamon is one, they start out in an exceptionally rich and really valuable province. They start in Asia, which has two wonders. If you consolidate the two of them under your banners, you will absolutely have a thriving early game economy, one that's not surpassed by very many factions. The other thing is that Pergamon has a variety of not exceptionally strong troops, but exceptionally cost-effective troops. And they also prioritize melee infantry and skirmishers, which is a very rare combination for a Hellenic or Hellenistic faction. So without further ado, let's just look into what Pergamon has to offer and see what we can do with this faction. Alright everybody, so this is Pergamon's start position, and in the game opener, when you choose which faction you want to play, Pergamon is labeled as a hard faction. However, I don't believe that to be the case at all in Divide et Impera. In fact, I fully believe that Pergamon is an awkward faction at the start. If you don't know exactly which moves you need to make, it can be a rather uncomfortable start position. However, once you do know what moves to make, it actually isn't really that hard. In fact, you are very much blessed to start out in the province of Asia because there's vast resources here, a mostly Hellenic population from the onset, making the start position far easier when it comes to public order than say something like Camarria or Colchis or really any Greek faction that is not in Greece, where you have to rule over a large amount of foreigners. In this case, you have a pretty easy time when it comes to population and public order. All the factions you're conquering in your province are Greek factions too, so they are going to have large Greek populations in their cities, which you can just take command of instantaneously. And of course, the two wonders, one of which is in Ephasos, the other of which is Rhodes. And in that order is what I suggest that you do for your conquests, because as you can see, your province is shared by two factions, one of which is Lydia, and the other faction is Rhodes. Pergamon does not have a port, so you don't have access to diplomacy with very many factions. You can really only suggest trade treaties with the Lydians, who, in my experience, they generally will accept one. However, I wouldn't really recommend taking it because ultimately you kind of do need to you do need to attack these guys. As you can see, the only settlements in Asia that you share a border with are the Lydian settlements. So where are you going to expand? And I wouldn't really recommend turtling up here. I guess in theory you could go to Bithynia, but I think that's just such a waste of time. Just attack the Lydians. Now, they are the satraps of the Seleucids, so ultimately you are going to end up at war with the Seleucid Empire at the beginning of your campaign, but I just feel like that's inevitable. You have to take these settlements. I don't really see an alternate way to play this campaign and actually make a viable choice here. So yeah, I'd attack these guys, and you know what? The Seleucids are all the way down here in Syria. So at the end of the day, I don't really think that they're going to end up marching all the way through Galatia and Cappadocia and into your province. That's just so far-fetched. And the Seleucids always go to war against the Ptolemies at turn 2. So they're going to have their hands full fighting the pharaohs of Egypt rather than thinking about, the affairs of faraway Asia Minor. They have trouble a lot closer to home. So don't be worried about being at war with the Seleucids. At the end of the day, they probably won't fight you. And when you do decide if you want to engage with them, you can engage on your own terms. This province is also highly defensible, and I feel like you can quite easily hold the Seleucids over here near Pessinos. But regardless, what you're going to do at first is you're going to train an army and you're going to attack Ephasos. The next recommendation I have is to send your army either with a ship or just pedal them over. Ephasos, literally you can hit it from here. It's a winter marching debuff right now, but you can see that during the winter you can almost attack this in one turn. During any other season you can attack this in one turn. Even if you just moved your army here, just right outside a city, then you can attack these guys right away the next turn, guaranteed. So absolutely just attack from here. take Ephasos with ease. It'll probably even be unguarded when you attack it, because usually the Lydians will like send their army like up here or something. So take Ephasos with ease, and then after that, go and take Rhodes. Because the thing about the Rhodesians, or the Rhodians, or whatever you want to call them, Rhodesian sounds cool, plus an allusion to a, you know, to a state that existed in what you could consider modern times. Regardless, the people of Rhodes, the thing is that they, for one, they have an army that's mostly made of hoplites, so your Pergamese army will counter them well. And two, the Rhodes, the people of Rhodes, the Rhodesians, they do tend to declare war on you if you take Pessinos and Ephasos first. Like, I tested this out offline, off camera. If I took Ephasos and Pessinos, the Rhodians, they always attacked. They always attacked real soon, guys. So, ultimately, you want to prevent that, and you want to take these two together. The other reason why is because if you control these two cities with for wonders, I have found that your economy just goes nuclear instantly. Like, you're making a reasonable 1900 from the very onset. However, if you take these two settlements, your income will quickly jump to like near 5,000, near 4,000, depending on what you recruit, of course, but it'll jump really, really suddenly because these two wonders together are just very overpowered when it comes to early game economy. So I take these two, and then after that, just finish off your conquest of the Lydians, take Pessinos, and then after that, you have all of Asia under your control. After that, I would honestly just recommend turtling up in Asia. Just have like a nice, solid defensive army at Pessinos to like deter the Galatians from invading, to deter the Bithynians from betraying you and, you know, attacking, and of course to hold off the Seleucids if they do end up attacking you, for they are a greedy and ambitious people, and ultimately they may attack. You just never know. Now, when it comes to your early game roster, I'll just display it here. You have some really good options, however, some also glaring weaknesses. Your glaring weakness lies in these Pergamese pikemen, who, while they are useful enough to, you know, counter Rhodian hoplites, of course, pikemen just counter hoplites as a principle, but the thing about these guys is that they have weaker stats than pretty much any other Hellenic or Hellenistic factions pikemen. So ultimately these guys are going to be rather weak against anything that's like Seleucid based, but you know what, they will be sufficient to take on the Lydians, who tend to manage their military awfully. Like, these guys just will recruit really weird, really crappy, really misplaced armies. And of course the Rhodians, who focus on hoplites. So have a nice core of these guys. Also recruit lots of these Carian axemen. They are an absolute gem of an early game unit. Like, 20 armor is really good for early game, but you combine that with 225 men of a medium weight, which is rare, of a medium weight, while also maintaining 3 speed, 1 ammunition, having a charge bonus of 28, which is crazy. So the shock potential on these troops are great. Combine that with 14 armor penetration damage. Like, this is an absolutely stacked axeman, comparable to the best of early game barbarian axemen, even better than the vast majority of early game axemen just in totality. Like, this is such a great unit that, yes, like, it's expensive. It's about as expensive as a pikeman or a hoplite, but you really need these guys to flesh out your army. So I would take like 4 of these in an early game army, have like a nice pike core. You know, you don't really need more hoplites. I wouldn't really recommend it. I don't think that they'll be all that useful in this region. And then for your skirmishers, you really do have choices here. You have a bunch of elite peltis. It's kind of like what your faction prioritizes. They also do have this slinger, this Trallian slinger, which is a pretty cost-effective, decent slinger. It's one of those 190, 11 missile damage slingers, so they can be useful as well if you want to save money. But if you really want to like have the most elite, most powerful army objectively that you can in early game, I would take these Phrygian peltis. They're absolutely phenomenal melee fighters. I mean, 30 armor is just really, really good in early game. There's few units that hit 30 armor. for like missile units. That's just unheard of. That's ludicrous. And then 11 melee attack and 20 melee defense is super duper duper competitive in general, but in early game, again, it's criminal. The only thing is that this isn't one of those peltas that like gets a really good charge bonus. Or charge bonus is below average. It's pretty mediocre. There's a lot of peltas that their main like melee combat stat is it's shock value, kind of like a Thracian Peltis. And this is the opposite. This is one of those that goes into battle and is essentially just like a makeshift part of your infantry line. They just enhance the total, like, stability of your infantry line by being just another one of the boys, basically. Just another one of the infantry. But you know what? That's absolutely forgivable. It's still such a powerful unit that you can get a couple of these, or you can substitute them for Trallian Slingers. Until you have your next level barrack, you're really not going to have any cavalry options that are worth recruiting. You could look out and get them in mercenaries, which, speaking of mercenaries, look out for these mercenary pikemen. They're basically like your average Greek pike unit with, like, I think it's like 35 armor on this particular mercenary, as well as your typical 9 attack and 12 melee defense. So this is actually a better pikeman than your Pergamese pikemen. So you're going to want to recruit these. And then outside of this, you could go for Tarentine Cav. If it's like early game, you just want to have better options. And of course, I really highly recommend that you get these Cretan archers. I just feel like they're so good in this region to counter enemy cavalry, to counter enemy light infantry, to counter enemy pikes. Honestly, I don't use Cretans a lot, but the couple of times I recruited them during my Pergamese testing, they just were so effective against like the different factions in Asia, but I just recommend them. They did wonders against the Rhodians and the Lydians. But yeah, once they've consolidated this province, I would not recommend expanding in Asia Minor. This is just such a great part of Asia to hold, and if you go and like take all of Pontus, or taking this narrow strip which is really exposed, like from Galatia and Cappadocia, from Armenia, from the Caucasus, it is just like such an exposed territory. Meanwhile, the Galatia and Cappadocia itself, I feel like is just such a hard province to hold. And the Galatians, they have a really, really good roster to counter yours. You will be very, very uncomfortable fighting the Galatians. So what I have devised is actually just raising a navy and then invading Greece, because ultimately, Greece will offer you an extremely easy to control population, great wealth, and just a fertile place to really be able to spread your wings and conquer more territory. So I'd recommend attacking Greece and getting into Macedon, or even Thrace. Thrace would also be a great option, and it's one further away from Rome, so if you don't want to test yourself against those guys anytime soon, Thrace would be an easier place to expand to. But that's the campaign map. I feel like I've gone over this longer than most, but it just, again, like this campaign is labeled as a hard campaign, and ultimately, if you actually just play your cards right, just take Ephasos, then Rhodes, then Pessanos, and then afterwards just hold from here and expand elsewhere where you can find the resources or opponents that you want, then this campaign is actually pretty easy to just take by the horns and lead towards glory. But that's all I have to say, guys. Let's go into the factional buffs and debuffs, and of course the roster review, which I'm really looking forward to. Alright guys, so this is Pergamon's buffs and debuffs, and frankly, they're honestly quite decent. Just overall, you get a nice set of buffs. Now, Hellas gets, or rather the Hellenes, they get some rather strong buffs up here in my opinion. They're just classics. They're just in general useful. You get plus 5% research rate, which in the case of Pergamon is actually exceptionally useful, I find, because it allows you to do your initial militaristic research like 2 or 3 turns quicker than it would without this buff, meaning that like your first military technology will take 3 turns instead of 4, and then your second military technology I think will take 4 turns instead of 5. Yeah, I think it's 2 turns saved in total, which it just felt like you can get your second tier barrack really quick and start recruiting some of the better units Pergamon has, expanding your general like early game military capacity quite a bit. Like, all of these Hellenic and Hellenistic factions over turn 1 barrack always start out with severe limitations, whether it's a lack of melee infantry or cavalry or pikes. Like in Pergamon's case, they had decent melee infantry options, although limited ones, but the Carian Axemen are really good. But of course, that's really all that they had that was worth recruiting. They had ample missile units, absolutely can't complain about that. And their phalanxes were good, but they had absolutely no cavalry. Getting your second tier barrack will rectify that quite a bit. So it absolutely is useful in the case of Pergamon, really, really useful. The +2 to cultural conversion, just a general like quality of life thing. Like in all honesty, it's just a useful buff to have. I love this buff, right? The quicker you can convert foreign cultures towards your own, the sooner you won't have those nasty public order penalties. So it's a useful one to have. Now, the other buffs that you get that are Pergamon specific are a mixed bag. Like, for example, decreased building costs, like, that's okay. Obviously, it's better than having increased building costs, don't get me wrong. But it's really not all that useful, because if you're resourceful in a Rome 2 campaign, you could just cobble together, like, enough money to afford the buildings you want. Just sack a settlement. And just make sure that you're investing in your resources, you're taxing your people appropriately, you're extorting your neighbors, like whatever you gotta do, but I always find money where it needs to. So, you know, I'd much rather have something that affects the military or something like that. But you know what? It's there. Now, diplomatic bonuses with Hellenic factions is insane when it comes to Pergamon, because it just allows you to create all of these diplomatic relations, these trade agreements, these alliances on the fly. Like Athens and Crete will absolutely beg you for a trade agreement right from the onset. The Ptolemies will beg you for a trade agreement from the onset. If you, in theory, wanted to be friends with the Seleucids and you didn't attack Lydia, they'd be willing to accept your hand in friendship. And you know what? As you could have seen at the very beginning, being friends with the Lydians is absolutely an option. Every Greek faction will love you as Pergamon, and that's just a massive, massive advantage to have. There's so many Greek factions in the game, so use this wisely, but you can pretty much use this to leverage defensive alliances, military alliances, and basically get like really easy trade agreements with any Hellenic faction. So huge plus. One of the most powerful buffs that I've seen throughout the Hellenic and Hellenistic factions. But then they have a pretty nasty debuff, which is increased non-mercenary recruitment cost, meaning that economic management, particularly going into late game, may prove somewhat challenging because your armies will have an extra expense. And we found that Pergamese cavalry is really when you feel it. Like, the cavalry of Pergamon is not insane, it's pretty mid. In the context of Hellenistic and Hellenic factions, it's really mid to mediocre. In fact, I think it probably crosses more into mediocre. So ultimately, to have like that cavalry cost as much as it does, it feels like you're just getting robbed. So yeah, a lot of price here, but you know what? You are surrounded by provinces with really strong mercenaries. From Asia to Hellas to Thrace, you can find phenomenal mercenaries, so you can maybe get around this if you're resourceful, but those are the buffs and debuffs. That diplomatic bonus of Hellenic factions definitely makes it an interesting playthrough, because you can definitely get alliances a lot easier with Pergamon than pretty much any faction I've seen here, and just play a campaign where your allies play a significant role in your game plan if you want to do that. But moving on now to the roster, we will see the full might of Pergamon on display. Now, this is Pergamon's roster, and as you can see from the very onset, you have a lot of general options, far more than the vast majority of factions will get, so you definitely have a lot of flexibility when it comes to what you want to make your general. Now, it's really in the melee infantry and the missile infantry where I think you're going to see the total might of Pergamon. However, if I'm going to be completely honest with you, the melee infantry component is rather mid compared to, say, barbarian factions or Roman factions or anything like that. So despite this component of our army being far stronger than the vast majority of Hellenic and Hellenistic factions, it's not like game-breaking by any means, and that limitation does hurt Pergamon in the grand scheme of things. But if you're looking for specifically a Greek faction to specialize in those two tools, then Pergamon is your guy. If you're really just looking for that Greek faction that does skirmishing and melee and of course these loosely bound spear infantry just superbly, then that's what you're gonna do. But anyway, let's start with the generals here, boys. Let's start with the generals. You start out with a Pergamese hoplite. It's your generic hoplite. This Pergamese hoplite has nothing exceptional about it. It also has no weaknesses compared to your average hoplite. It's an average hoplite. It's an income-saving general unit. If you're trying to hurriedly recruit an army and you're just like, you know, you're just desperate, you're trying to defend a minor settlement, but you have barely any cash left, this is probably what your general is going to be, but in the grand scheme of things, it's a pretty crap general to have. So if I can avoid using a hoplite as my general, I absolutely will. Now, this Pergamese Elite Peltis is only available with the Thorax reforms, I'm pretty sure, so you're not going to get them right at the beginning. Now, when it comes to using a skirmisher as a general, I feel like that's a very interesting and risky decision. It is like this is like one of those contexts where if someone says interesting, they just mean by like it's bad. Like, oh, that's an interesting choice in fashion. Because like, first of all, it's a 131 man unit, which is like, why would you want less guards for your general? Secondly, every skirmisher is going to be somewhat restricted in how much total morale they can have, and 47 morale is not great, so why would you have your general in a unit that will rout easier than the vast majority of units? Like, it's just not that great. You know, 35 armor is great for a skirmisher, but for, you know, for general, just like average. Like, I don't know, I just wouldn't have my general in a skirmisher. Like, if you really just want to bring an elite peltis, sure, but do you really want your general participating in a skirmish? You know what I mean? Like, you don't want your general actually doing a ton of skirmishing unless you're just being really conservative and only using him in the right situation. So I just feel like if you're gonna bring this unit, as much of a tank as it is, I would bring it as just a regular unit, not as my general. But yeah, so moving on, you have your Pergamese Royal Champions, your elite hoplites. And while these guys look above average for elite hoplites in terms of vanity, their armor, their helmets, just a full assortment of gear that Pergamon use is just like top tier. Like, they're just really cool. As a faction, they're just cool dudes. But like, this unit is just absolutely an average elite hoplite. The stats are mid. There are below average elite hoplites, but this is just an average elite hoplite, so that means it's solid. That means it's absolutely solid. And you know what, in early game, you're not going to get like the sword general. This is a Thorax unit. So, you know what, in early game, this is going to be like your elite infantry general. So if you ever want to go for an infantry general and just save on the cavalry, then get these guys. However, I would probably choose cavalry if we're just looking for the most optimal choice. If you're just trying to like min-max, you know, infantry could be good, but if you're trying to go for the most powerful army that Pergamon can construct, I would go for cavalry, because this cavalry unit is very hard to recruit, but also because I just think cavalry generals are superior. Now, once you hit 4x reforms, you have the option of this elite bodyguard infantry, and these guys stack up to the silver shields of the Seleucids. In fact, I believe that they have pretty much identical stats, if I'm not wrong. The silver shields have worse stats, actually. The silver shields have 3 less armor, so these guys are better than silver shields. And you'd think, oh, that's a cause to rejoice. Silver shields must be absolutely based. I mean, remember them in Rome 1? But guys, this is Rome 2 Divide et Impera. Get away with that nostalgia. This unit is not amazing. Just in general, the elite infantry line of the Hellenes in general is exceptionally mediocre, and this is represented here. Like, in my tests, I've tried this one out against a variety of barbarian and Roman generals, you know, kind of like the higher echelons of melee infantry as we would consider them. And these guys get beat by like really like much cheaper units, like absolutely much cheaper, and early game units. Like, these guys lost to a Scipii Praetorian, aka the first sword general that Rome gets. Their early game general. The general of the early republic. Wait, no, sorry, not early republic, the mid-republic. Yes. The guy who fought against Hannibal. His bodyguard beat these guys. So I just wouldn't be super excited about these. Like, they are good in the context of Greek infantry. In fact, this is the best Greek melee infantry unit in Rome to divide at Impera. I say this like it objectively is, you know? Like maybe if there's like a backtrain unit that does some like interesting armor penetration that in theory might be better. And I don't know if you want to consider this Roman Trader Legionary. I think it'll beat. Actually, no, it'll go toe-to-toe with the Roman Trader Legionary. I don't think it'll win, actually. I think that it's like a 50-50 with the Roman Trader Legionary. You'd be surprised, guys. At 11-15 does a lot. You'd be very, very surprised, because these are the stats that like Roman Scipii General had, and like I said, it was a 50-50. Yeah, identical stats of the Scipii General. So this literally is a 50-50 against the Trader Legionaries, who are much cheaper to recruit, mind you, and come from the foreign population. But like, if you look at Bactria, no, this is a completely different type of unit. Yeah, so basically, this is like good, but don't expect it to wreck like every infantry unit, okay? It's just an above average late game infantry unit in the grand scheme of the game, but for Greeks it's dominant. Now moving on, we have the heavy lancers. I never recommend bringing this unit ever, but because Pergamon does have that does have a debuff with non-mercenary units costing more, this unit might just be egregiously expensive, so it might compel you to bring this unit. It might be a motivation, but in terms of like power, this is definitely not the play, but in terms of saving money on your general, it's the play. So if you want cavalry but can't afford this cavalry, bring this. This is the cavalry from Timu, essentially. Now, this is the general that you want. I believe it is available from early game, because I was recruiting a cavalry general in early game. So yeah, these guys are insane. 49 armor and 52 morale means that this is incredibly stable. 6 speed means that despite being an elite unit and a very heavy shot cavalry unit, they don't lose maneuverability. There's some cavalry that go down to like a 5, but this maintains a decent, reasonable average 6 in terms of movement speed. 50 charge bonus is competent, although not elite, but you know what? The 10 and 17 melee stats is elite. So this is like your elite melee cavalry. I know it's a shock, but this is effectively a melee cavalry. This is the type of cavalry that you want to charge into your enemy shot cavalry after they've charged. Like you want to get like an awkward counter charge, and then these guys just slaughter them with their superior fighting skills. So that's really the use of this. This unit can also absolutely be used for hammer and anvil, and considering that you're a phalanx-based faction, you absolutely want something that can help you with hammer and anvils. So just overall a great unit to bring, and definitely your best general in total, in my opinion. I think by far the most useful, as well as the unit that's going to keep your general the safest. So I'd recommend bringing these, but they are by far the most expensive, and because of a debuff, everything's expensive. So, you know, just worry about the money, but if you have the money, bring it. Now, when it comes to your infantry, I'm not going to analyze this unit because it's an area of recruitment units. So, actually no, sorry, this is a mercenary unit. I take that back, but anyway, mercenaries, not worth analyzing. We're not really part of the roster. You have a Foros sword. I've gone over this unit several times. That's several, and every single guide I've basically done, they're in it because I've been doing mainly Hellenic and Hellenistic factions thus far. This unit, I don't bring them in my campaigns. I think that they're just not the best, but you know what, now that I'm looking at this, because I didn't really look at this Freos sword before, but it's this Pergamon Freos sword, and I realized that the stats on this are different. The stats are definitely different. You know, now I really need to nerd out about this for a moment, guys. Let me find a faction with your typical Freos swords. See, this one has 9, 14, 13, 23. This has 11, 10, 18, and 26. This Freos sword is more offensive. Now, it still has the limitation of having 8 armor, and I believe the same, no, more morale, as well as this unit is cheaper. The Pergamese Freos sword is cheaper, guys. So, you know what? I think that this unit has the capacity to be a unit of interest to me. It does have the capacity to be a unit of interest to me, for sure. Because you know what? This Pergamese Freyo sword is better than its Galatian infantry, by far. Now, this unit's obviously available after the Freyos reforms, but look at the contrast here. Like, the Pergamese Freyo sword is quicker. It has a speed of 4, which is great. It has 225 minute compared to 150, while offering the same combat stats, which is already a huge win. And the Galatian infantry has, like, 2 more armor, but that's, like, negligible. Compared to having 75 men, just the killing potential of this Pergamese Freyo sword is good. So, you know what? For the second time in my faction reviews, ladies and gentlemen, I am saying that this Pergamese Freyo sword is worth bringing. But I mean that about Freyo swords in general. I never advise that you bring them, but you know what? This one offers good combat stats combined with that skirmish capacity given by the 3 javelins that Freyo swords have. So honestly, a great unit. Like, these guys can be a substitute for some expensive skirmishers in mid-game, as well as offer some decent troops on your flanks. Like, I wouldn't bring a lot of these. I wouldn't rely on them, but these guys can be an accessory to your army. So one of those, like, units that offer good utility. They're not like a game-winning unit by any means, but they're just like a nice unit to have. So I'd use them. Now, these guys are available in early game, but you need to get your level 2 barrack to recruit them. Now, like I said, your level 2 barrack is surprisingly accessible because of your enhanced research rate, but this unit is just very, very mid. Like, their combat stats of 11 and 10 are very good for early game. Like, they're above average for sure. You know, they're not like top tier, but they're above average for sure for early game. But then everything else here is mediocre. Like, 18 charge bonus is okay, but not great. Weapon damage of 26 is pretty good, but not amazing. 10 armor is eh. You know, for a barbarian unit in early game, it is kind of expected, but really not that good. 3 speed is good. 1 ammo expected, but you know, for light melee infantry too. At the end of a day, sorry guys, but at the end of a day, this is basically a above average early game melee infantry, but not amazing. And it's a type of unit that will basically become irrelevant after like 1 reform. But during like the first 60 turns, these guys can hit hard, but don't expect these guys to be absolutely phenomenal or like amazing or anything. Like, this unit is just okay. It's just there. Like, they're slightly above average, but they're not amazing. But you know what they are, guys? They are very, very cheap. Like, my turn income on 1 unit of these guys was 130. So they give you a very nice, like, mid-cost, like, much cheaper than, like, a hoplite or an actual phalanx, you know. Definitely more expensive than, like, a levy, but you know, these guys are just cost-effective. That's what they are. They're cost-effective. But again, like, a nice unit to have in your army, not like a game-winning unit, but just like a nice, cheap, cost-effective unit. And that's the thing about Pergamon. Like, you're not going to have a lot of game winners, but you're gonna have the income because Asia is a great province, and you're going to have these like really cost-effective units. So as long as you're not going against one of those killer factions, you can win, or you can just overwhelm your opponent with many armies. I'm gonna skip the Cretan infantry because that's a mercenary, and now we just jump right into the Forax reforms. And for the Forax reforms, you get your Pergamese Forax swordsman. I did check these guys out. Identical stats to your typical Forax swordsman, meaning that these guys are the kings of mediocrity when it comes to late game. Forax swordsmen, like, they're a reasonable unit in late game. Like, they can hang, but ultimately they are gonna lose to anything that is interesting. Like, any good barbarian infantry, Roman, like better Greek infantry, like, they're just like the baseline of what you expect a late game infantry unit to be in Divide et Impera, and then basically any other unit will build on that baseline and outperform it. So it is what it is. Like, you bring them if you have to, but the problem is that when you're fighting other factions, like, these guys aren't gonna beat anything of the same caliber. But they'll beat things that are lower. Like, if your opponent's coming at you with kind of an outdated army, then these guys will, of course, stomp. But that's what you have to expect out of Pergamese 4X swordsmen. The elite bodyguard infantry are far better, but they do come from your first population class and are very expensive to maintain. Very, very expensive to maintain. And like I mentioned, they just lose to like regular Roman units, and any better Roman unit like an Avocati, an armored legionary, even like an Imperial legionary, it's just better. It's just better, guys. I'm saying that completely unironically. In all my testing, these guys were extremely mid. So, truthfully, while it is nice to have something that's better than a 4X swordsman, because this is, you know, your Greek archetype of what melee infantry is, and the Greeks just don't understand melee like barbarians do. This just ends up being a pretty meh unit. That's all you can really say about them, but, you know, how many other factions that are Greek factions really have an alternative to this? Like, the Ptolemies have the Romans, but they only get 8 of those. The Seleucids have their silver shields, but they're even worse than these. Even no other faction really has a great alternative. I mean, there's Epirus, they have the Thesprotians. Let's see what the late game Thesprotian stats are, because I think that they're probably worse than these guys. They are worse in terms of armor, so like I said, these guys are better. So ultimately, when it comes to the Greek archetype, this is the best melee infantry you can get. So if you're looking for Greeks that can do melee with swords, this is going to be it. Now moving on to your spears, you start out with your Pergamese light hoplites. Now I've seen light hoplites that had 15 armor, I've seen some with 8 armor, this one has 10, so this one is slightly above average. Actually no, it's pretty average. It's just not really that good. Like, the main thing that I use light hoplites for is just you put them on the wings and they basically win you the cavalry fight, because they are insane against cavalry. Against infantry, they can hold their own, but they're nothing special. The main thing is that they're really quick, so these guys are great for flanking. So you kind of use them for that, but these are not like a main line at all. This is something you put on your flanks, and you know, I'd rather have like one of these on my flanks or one of these on my flanks. But you know what, I guess if you combine these and these and these in tandem, then maybe you could just kind of make a more solid composition of different skill sets. Like, the Pergamese light hoplites help you deal with cavalry, the Galatians are more like dealing with the enemy infantry, the Phraeus are more for like skirmishing and then you go into combat with them. So I feel like the 3 of these will make a powerful wombo combo, but this is again like one of those accessory units. They're cost effective, but they come from your second population class, so be mindful of that. The Phraeus Spear, this unit, just your generic Phraeus Spear, it's like a really solid unit for holding your flanks, because they have just great defensive stats, and they're resilient, they'll just last a long time because of that. Ultimately, they don't, like, kill a ton unless you just really utilize them well in a battle. Their aggressive capacities are not exceptional, but they're not utterly mediocre either. Like, we can still hang, we can still get plenty of kills. Just overall, an amazing, amazing cost-effective unit. This is before, you know, late game when Greek melee infantry get outclassed completely. These guys are good. But speaking of that, the Pergamese have a special Phraeus unit, the Elite Phraeus Spear, which has 150 men, but, you know, actually I was about to say that they've become heavier, but actually they don't. They stay a medium spear infantry. What they do though, is they get more base morale, they get more armor, as you can see. Then bonus versus cavalry goes up to 25, making these cavalry-crunching monsters. If you're fighting against something like a Parthian cataphract, recruit these at spades, for they will bring those cataphracts to the ground. And then they offer really elite melee stats, like 21 melee defense is crazy. 21 weapon damage for a spear unit is insane. These guys have just phenomenal melee stats, just overall take of a unit. Expensive, yes, but you know, if you can get these guys around the same price as like a pike or a hoplite, I feel like these guys just outperform them because, you know, like they aren't bound by the phalanx. Like, they don't have to be in a solid line to be effective. These guys are a lot more loose. They have far better charge capacity. They have more offensive capabilities. They have good armor. They maintain for good armor despite that. Just overall, I just feel like this unit is just better. But you know what? They are a very good unit. Like, this is what you want to ideally recruit during your Phraeus time period. Like, this is just like a nice little accessory. This is a solid unit. This is an elite unit. This is something that'll go into melee and beat the crap out of enemy spears. Just annihilate them. Now moving on, because this is a very solid unit. super high up unit. Now you have mercenaries. It's like whatever. Mercenary. Not gonna say anything exceptional. Now you have your Pergamese 4x spearmen, and this is better than your typical 4x spearmen. Let's pull out your typical 4x spearmen just for comparison. As you can see, the Pergamese 4x spearmen has 1 more melee attack, 2 more melee defense, I believe. Wait, no, it's 2. Yeah, it's 2 more. 2 more charge, 2 more weapon damage. Just overall better unit. More armor. More armor by 3, I believe. Yeah, more armor as well. Same base morale. No ammunition. I think I've seen like a special 4x spear. I think the Bosphorus spear has ammo. But you know, in general, they don't. Also, this unit can form a hollow square formation as well as defensive formation. And I don't believe the hollow square is formed. Actually, it is formed by regular 4x spearmen. I haven't used 4x spears a ton. It's not my favorite unit. It just, by the time I get to late game, and also keep in mind, I played like an Egypt campaign fully through. I played a Sparta campaign fully through. Those are the 2 Hellenic factions I've actually gone all the way through with. So, you know, neither of them really use a 4x spear-like unit in abundance in late game unless you want to. You can avoid it for sure. But like, this is a really good version of a unit. Again, 4x spears, they're not the most like audacious killers. They really aren't the greatest at killing because 9 melee attack in late game is exceptionally poor. And these guys don't have like the phalanx thing when it's just kind of awkward to engage them, engage against them, so they won't like kill as much as pikes do just because they're a pike unit. You know, these guys have to go hand to hand, so they really won't kill a ton. But ultimately, this is such a solid defensive unit that it will just hold back the tide of the enemy forever. You can absolutely use these guys as like a main line to not have such an inflexible formation like you would with these phalanxes. You can also use them on the flanks against cavalry. They'll do wonders against them. Just keep in mind, this unit's pretty slow, so it's not very maneuverable, but really, really solid late game unit. A lot of utility here as either your main line or on the flanks. Now moving on to your phalanxes, start out with a Levy Hoplite. Nothing to say here. Levy Hoplites are incredibly bad. Nothing to do with them other than to recruit them for a desperate defense of a minor settlement. Otherwise, don't use them unless you're also just trying desperately to recruit something and you have no cash. Now, moving on, you have your Pergamese Hoplites. Again, completely average Hoplite, and subsequently, I wouldn't really recommend that you recruit these guys because you are deep in successor state territory, meaning that you're going to be fighting against a lot of pikemen. Now, if you bring Hoplites against pikemen, you know what's going to happen. Also, you're close to Hellas. You're close to the Greeks, which don't recruit pikemen till later in the game, so bring your pikemen. It's just at the end of the day, pikemen are so much better than hoplites at this point in Divide et Impera that I wouldn't really recommend recruiting phalanxes. Also, they're not that much cheaper than your pikemen too. So at the end of the day, there's just so many reasons not to really get these guys, and yeah, I just wouldn't really go for it. Now, you also have Pergamese pikemen. Now, Pergamese pikemen, they are weaker than your average pike, and I say this with no hesitation, with absolutely no reservation. This pike unit has better stats all around. There's nothing that the Pergamese pikeman does better, it's just overall worse. It has 2 less melee defense, it has 5 less armor, it has 3 less base morale. It just overall is a worse unit. They're not quicker. I don't believe her bonus versus cavalry or elephants is better. It's exactly the same. So ultimately, this unit is just a mediocre early game pike, and you also don't get a 4x pike, you don't get a Phreos pike, you don't get an elite pike. Ultimately, the strength of the late game Pergamese army is having a better than average 4x spear and a better than average 4x sword, but you ultimately do lose out on having better phalanxes, and this is just a massive weakness of the Pergamon, of the Pergamese. I mean, at the end of the day, if you're engaging against the Seleucids, or engaging against the Ptolemies, or engaging against any successor state in late game that comes at you with elite pikemen, your phalanx is just going to break really quickly. And then what are you going to do? You can't win against the enemy phalanx and the rest of your combined arms with just your melee infantry and your cavalry. So at the end of the day, like whenever you fight a successor state that already has like higher level pikemen, and you know, every successor state has better pikemen than you. You're gonna have to be really creative about using the rest of your army and not engage the phalanxes, which, you know, you can avoid it. You can definitely avoid it. Like, you can just overpower the enemy on the flanks and then kind of get the phalanx to not engage until the battle's already pretty much over. You can avoid it. Phalanxes are slow moving. But I'm just saying that this is like the worst early game pike that you're gonna get. Like besides like Caucasian pikemen or just some weird pike units that are on the edge of civilization, this unit is worse. Now they are a bit cheaper, but because of your debuff, they're not actually cheaper for you to maintain. So yeah, overall, just not a great unit, but it is what you have, and because you have the better melee infantry, this is the sacrifice that you make. Now you have your Pergamese Royal Companions, like I said before. They are average elite hoplites, so use them if you want elite hoplites that come from your first population class, and that's really all that there is to say. Now, for your missile infantry, you do have fabulous skirmish options compared to the vast majority of Hellenic or Hellenistic factions, but your Peltis are the main part that shines. So if you don't like getting down and dirty with Peltis, then this faction might not be for you, because this is an essential component of your killing power as Pergamon. Now, at first, you just have your generic Greek Javelin men and Greek Archers, nothing to say. Every Greek faction has them. They're incredibly mediocre. Greek Javelins, poo-poo, don't bring them. Greek Archers are an incredibly mediocre archer, but if you happen to want archers, bring them. But you know what? If you really just, honestly, bring these Trallian Slingers if you want to bring any like long-range skirmisher. They have a nice range of 190, and while they only shoot 5 shots per minute, which is really slow, they do have the better 11 missile damage, which at this point you're getting close to the archer, you outrange the archer, you have 20 ammunition, so you have better ammunition, and you have better melee stats than your Greek archer by a decent amount. But of course, this Trallian Slinger is by no means a good melee fighter. They have better melee stats than your archer or your javelin men, but ultimately, these are still horrible melee stats. These guys will go running and screaming after any melee engagement. And just overall, it's a pretty mediocre slinger because it shoots so slow. But it also comes from your third population class, and they are really, really cheap. They are really cheap for a 190 slinger. I think that they're cheaper than average. So yeah, for long range, this is really your only option, in my opinion. Then moving on to your Peltis, you're going to start out with his Pergamene Peltis, and this is supposedly of Gallo-Thracian origin. However, unlike the vast majority of Thracian units, these guys don't pack a super impactful charge. Like, 18 is okay, but it's a very mid-charge. You know, maybe it's above average when it comes to the world of Peltis, but if you just compare this like objectively just as a unit in Divide et Impera, it's not like a phenomenally charging unit, it's just like okay. 8 armor is relatively low though, and as an actual like skirmisher, that armor is probably going to prevent it, because when it comes to like javelin throwing units, I really value armor highly, because these guys are probably going to take a lot of damage performing their tasks, so ultimately having 8 armor is definitely a setback. But you know what, 90 range and 22 missile damage is really good. Like, these guys, if they don't get shot to pieces, they're really good at throwing their stuff. And you know what, 18 charge and 26 weapon damage is pretty good. Like, these guys are competent in melee. Don't get me wrong, like, I'm not saying that these guys are horrible in melee or anything. They're just valuable. Like, 8 armor and 35 morale is not great on those stats, but they do a great job skirmishing. 11 melee attack and 10 melee defense is obviously really good. And 18 is a decent charge. Like, it's not an amazing charge, but you know what? It's decent. It's like that of a Phreo Spear. It's like that of a Galatian Infantry. It's a good charge. I mean, you know what? At the end of the day, these guys are a really interesting part of your roster, because they're once again a super cost-effective unit, but not like a game-breaking unit. Like, these guys aren't overpowered by any means. They're not like a unit that's just gonna go in there and dominate the field effortlessly. Like, you have to put effort to get super duper high like impact out of these guys, but the value you're gonna get considering how much you pay for them is really high. The only negative is that this unit does come from your second population class, so you do have to expend some citizens to get these guys, but that's the thing, super cost effective. But if you're looking for just an overall luxurious upgrade, look towards your Phrygian Peltis. These guys, you know, as actual skirmishers, interestingly enough, are worse, because they shoot 1 less javelin per minute and have 1 less javelin on them. But they have better melee stats, they have way more melee defense, Their charge bonus goes down, their weapon damage goes down by 1, but they exchange that 8 armor for 30 armor and have 39 base morale rather than 35. So just overall, they are undoubtedly a melee upgrade. Like, you push these guys into battle, and they will perform way better and last way longer. But of course, this is the type of, like, Peltus that lasts. This is not the type of Peltus that dominates the field. It just, like, does a lot of shock value. Like, this is better as shock. This is more like what you'd expect out of, like, an Adrician Peltus, although I believe the Adrician Peltus will have better shock stats. Like, how do we place this in the world of Peltus? Let's just figure this out. 9-6, but then, like, look at that charge, 21. And then, obviously, these guys do armor penetration as well. So, like, this is better at shock, but not an amazing shock Peltus in a grand scheme of things. This is, like, no shock at all, but also, this is a better Peltus than your standard Greek Peltus. Like, if I go towards one of those, let's pick... The Ptolemies will have your basic Greek Peltus, I believe. Yes, they will. Where's your early Peltus? Oh, they don't have the early Peltus. That's the problem, though. Syracuse? They don't even have Peltus, but I haven't done my Syracuse faction review yet, so not surprised. There we go. Yeah, this is your early Peltus. It's gonna have 8 melee attack, 16 melee defense, and 15 armor. So it's just like a way better unit. It's like double the armor and better melee stats. 2 more melee attack. Yeah, it's overall better. So yeah, just a luxurious thing. And once you hit 4-axe, you could just get a nice upgrade on these guys again. You get 1 more melee attack, 1 less melee defense. I don't really know how to feel about that, but like, it's not a huge change. 1 more charge, 2 more weapon damage, but like big morale upgrade. 8 more morale, 5 more armor. And you actually do better with your javelins too, although you shoot less quickly as well. Like, this Pergamese Elite Peltus, interestingly enough, is not a massive upgrade because you get worse at some things. Like, you have less melee defense, and you actually lose some of your shooting speed. You also lose some of your speed as well. This unit becomes heavier, like literally. It goes from a medium missile infantry to a heavy missile infantry. So it is just overall, like, not an amazingly better unit. I would say it is a little bit better. Not like amazingly better, but just overall in the grand scheme of things, it is one of the best Peltus in the game. Like, it will compare to your Adrician Noble Peltus. Not in terms of her role, because the Adrician unit will just inevitably be a shock unit. But in terms of, like, caliber, you know, like 13 melee attack, 10 melee defense, 23 missile damage as well. Better shooting stats in general, but, you know, less armor on the Adrician. You know, you get the melee AP here, and you get more charge, but you get less melee defense and attack, like, as a total stat. So, like, at the end of the day, it isn't the same caliber. This is a dominant Peltus. If you love your Peltus, you're gonna love Pergamon. Now, moving on to shock cavalry. There actually isn't really a whole lot of interest here, and this is really what we're gonna go over for the most part. Like, going on with the Tarentine cavalry here. This is just your basic Tarentine. Like, a lot of Greek factions have access to these guys for good. I know they have 90 men, which is more than the 75 you typically have, but they have less armor. Ultimately, these guys are kind of like in the same category of citizen cavalry, but they're a little bit more flexible, and I always say this. Nothing amazing about this unit, but they're just overall high utility, kind of cost effective for cavalry, and that's it. Pergamese cavalry, this is your standard citizen cavalry, incredibly generic, useful in combat. No one ever said in Divide et Impera, because in Divide et Impera citizen cavalry is completely different, but no one's ever said in Divide et Impera, like, you, my citizen cavalry, completely and utterly useless unit. This unit can do your hammer and anvils, they can go in and fight against enemy, against enemy shock cavalry, like actual lancers, and beat them as long as you get a good engagement. And they will absolutely wipe out medium, light infantry, as well as skirmishers. Like, they are useful, but at the end of the day, they also are not exceptional. They are the definition of average, so you don't really want average as your main shock cavalry. And so far, we have average everywhere. These heavy lancers are below average. I absolutely despise this unit, but in the context of having a more expensive non-mercenary core to begin with, I would say with these guys have a use in this roster, specifically as like a cheap cavalry general, but I never want to recruit these because this is just like one of the worst like shock cavalry, like lancer units when it just comes to general stats for how much you pay for them. Like I just hate this unit. It's like, well, let's get outperformed routinely by other units that perform the same role, and that's my trouble with them, but it is what it is. Again, average, average, average. Now, Pergamon's 4x cavalry, this is a good melee cavalry. This is your typical late game melee cavalry, and I can say the same thing with this. This is your typical late game melee cavalry as well, but just of the noble variant. Like if you look at your Getic nobles, I believe that you will see very, 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 very similar stats here. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Slightly less armor on the Getic noble. However, the Getic noble also has more AP. I mean, they've got to have something, surely. I think the Pergamon's cavalry is better, but actually more expensive. So, you know, this unit is pretty well armored for a late game cavalry. I will give it that. This is like a solid late game melee style general. This is like a solid unit, but this is really the only solid that you have, because your missile is just made out of the generic Greek javelin cavalry, which I just never ever bring unless it's just like early game and I really want cavalry, and this is the only unit I can recruit. So yeah, as you can see, the Pergamon's roster really leaves a lot to be desired. I feel like this is the only unit that you can really bring that's gonna like wow the battlefield, just be a titan amongst men, and it is just in general like, you know, it basically just is like a citizen cavalry on epic steroids, buffed out of her minds kind of thing. So at the end of the day, like, it's not the most interesting unit. It's not like breaking a cataphract or like a companion cavalry that's gonna decimate things in the rear charge. Like, these guys are just, you know, they ride around, they kill cavalry and melee really effectively, they can do a hammer and anvil, but we don't have the same game-winning capacity, in my opinion, making this not like a mech unit entirely, but just overall your cavalry, you just know that it's not going to have a ton of impact in the context of this army. It's going to be utilizing your cost-effective melee infantry, from your elite Freyo spears to your 4-axe, your upgraded 4-axe units, these furrow swords and your Galatians, using these guys when they're relevant, making sure your Phrygian peltas join the infantry line, and you know, if you have a couple of these companion cavalry, then you're set. But overall, when it comes to Pergamon, I would say that the difficulty level of this campaign isn't super high. If you follow my advice, my kind of game plan, then I believe that this is not a very difficult campaign, because you have plenty of cost-effective units. You know, you have the trifecta, your Galatians, your Freyo swords, which are actually useful in this campaign, surprisingly. These phalanxes are pretty cost-effective and useful against some of your enemies, and Hellas and Rhodes and stuff, and of course these Pergamon peltas. If you recruit the trifecta of cost-effective units and some mercenaries and stuff, then you can absolutely use that early game economy and just leverage having a ton of armies in the field and just conquer whatever you want. So I think in terms of difficulty, it honestly is kind of like a 3. Just if you can like win your battles, if this is a solid enough army to do that, then you can expand really quickly and get super rich right away. But in terms of how powerful this roster is, you know, it's cost effective, but I don't think it's overall very powerful. In terms of power, I'd give it a solid 5 out of 10, you know? Like, I don't consider having the best javelins as like a huge asset. And even though, like, in terms of Greek factions, this melee infantry is great, in terms of all factions, this melee infantry isn't really that hot. You don't have a great shock infantry troop. These elite bodyguard infantry can get beat by a lot. This 4-axe spearman isn't the most combat effective just because of its lack of offensiveness. The only place where you're really going to dominate is with those elite Freyo spears, but this isn't like a late game domination. This is a mid game domination, and you know, that like interval when the Freyos reforms is basically the hottest, newest thing. it doesn't last super duper long in a campaign, you know? It's like the shortest period, you know, about mid-period, so that's why I don't value this, like, advantage, but it is something nice to have. But at the end of the day, I'd give them, like, a 5. You know, some factions have to be average, and I definitely have to put Pergamon in that average category, but it's definitely an easier campaign than most with that 3. Now, if they had better cavalry, they could have worked on that 5, but yeah, the cavalry really sealed the deal for me. I just feel like to have, like, really meh cavalry and really meh phalanxes as a Greek faction is just not the best. Like, you're buffing out, like, the weaker aspects of the Greek factions in exchange of sacrificing what they're best at, even though you do have some solid options. It's just not quite the same as another faction. Now, in terms of how much you need to play this campaign, I honestly feel like it is a pretty forgettable campaign. Like, there's just nothing exceptionally cool about this unless you're like a diplomatic nut. If you want to try to harness the full power of diplomatic alliances towards helping your campaign, this faction will make it just a breeze. Just pick your favorite Greek factions and buddy up with them. So if you're a diplomacy nut, I highly recommend you play this, or if you're just some sort of, like, you know, big Peltas fan or big Greek melee infantry fan, play it. But for the rest of us normal people, as if Total War fans that are normal exist, but the rest of us normal people, this is just a forgettable campaign. So I would give this like a 2 out of 10 in terms of how much you need to play this. You don't need to play this campaign. It's as simple as that. You know, it's so forgettable. From the start position in Asia to who you're fighting at from the onset to just this, like, roster in general, there's just something about it that just screams, like, generic. I don't know what it is about them, but there's just nothing about this faction which enchants me, which charms me. So, you know, just my opinion, but I'm giving it that 2 out of 10. But hey, that's Pergamon for you. I hope you guys liked it. We're almost done with the Hellenic and Hellenistic factions, and I'm just driving to get these guides out, guys, because ultimately I want to do all the factions in Rogue 2. So if that sounds interesting to you, like, subscribe to the video, and yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.